welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the developments in the non-Western parts of the world and their reactions to the growing uh, and expanding of imperial influence and spheres of influence to really you know, expand around the world. What we'll do is look at what was happening in China during the 19th century. Also, take a look at the developments in Japan, as well as briefly touch upon developments in India and the African continent as well. To start with China, there needs to be attention paid to the Opium Wars that happened in the first half of the 19th century. Really, since the 1820s, opium smuggling had been an increasingly chronic problem in China and for the Qing dynasty. This was an illegal importation that was coming from British-held India, where this crop, this drug essentially did very well in those climatic conditions. And so the Qing dynasty officials initially tried to work with the British to curtail the trade, the illicit trade, but these arrangements broke down, and as a result, Lin Zhu, the Qing dynasty imperial commissioner that was tasked by the emperor to go and begin to seize quantities and chests of opium and destroy them before they could make their way to market. So he begins to do exactly that. In 1838, he was successful in seizing and destroying some 3 million pounds of raw opium. And just 3 short years later, and by 1841, you have this culminating in what becomes known as the Opium War. The war was very brief, just lasting about a year, maybe a little more, and it was an overwhelming British victory. The British Navy by this time had a modern fleet at its disposal and just eviscerated the Chinese resistance. This led to the capture of several port cities along the Chinese coastline. The British were successful in blocking the Grand Canal. That helped as a key piece of infrastructure uniting the Qing Empire together along north-south lines. Also, this war, and really more importantly the treaty coming out of it, served as a template for what became known as the unequal treaties. With regard to the Opium War itself, the British gained access and basically sovereignty over Hong Kong. China also agreed to pay indemnities to the British for wartime costs, the wartime expenses that the British Empire had incurred. Also, 5 additional ports were opened to British trade, so there's an expansion of the trade network for the British, another kind of plus for them. Also, there were uniform import tariffs that would be implemented as well. And most importantly, there was a clause that provided for what became known, well, actually two key terms to this piece. One was extraterritoriality, which was essentially where the British citizens, British officials living in China, their families, and so on and so forth, would be subject not to Chinese law where they resided, but in effect they would be subject to British law. So that basically even though they were residing in China, they would still fall under the jurisdiction of British law. It's a severe kind of slap in the face to sovereignty. In the case of, or for Chinese sovereignty in this case. The second major kind of key clause here was the establishment of what became known as the most favored trade status. This was a stipulation that if China extended more favorable terms of trade to another country, then the same terms would be applied to trade between China and Japan. That Britain became, oh, excuse me, to between China and Britain, excuse me. This made it so that Britain was the most favored in conducting trade with China. Also, the opium trade continued after, in the wake of this first Opium War. This event and the treaty that came out of it really kind of opened the floodgates for other world powers or emerging world powers that essentially they began to smell, in essence, kind of blood in the water, and they began to exploit China as a result of that. By 1844, the United States and France also won similar concessions from China, each in their own separate treaties with China, the Qing government. And this would become a model in diplomatic negotiations between China, but also in diplomatic negotiations between Western powers and Japan as well, as we'll see in a few moments. China here is being perpetually victimized by this turn of events, and we'll kind of see continued evidence of that as well. Japan, in its experience, began to turn these unequal treaties and being on kind of the unequal end of these treaties. Japan began to turn these into opportunities for their own self-empowerment, and really kind of a much more effective strategy of kind of insulating itself as far as nationalist identity was concerned. Sticking with China, however, in the late 19th century, and really as a result of its ineffectiveness as a governing power and its increasing ineffectiveness, there is internal insurrection and rebellion. This is manifests itself in what becomes known as the Taiping Rebellion, lasting from 1850 to 1864. It is based on a Christian-inspired movement. It basically saw the Qing dynasty and its supporters as the embodiment of evil. It adhered to the followers of the rebels themselves, adhered to a strict code of morality. There was segregation among the sexes. There was a forbidding of the use of opium and all corruption, essentially. Should any of these moral codes be breached, then this would be punishable by death. During this 15-year period, or roughly 15-year period of rebellion and civil war in many cases, over 20 million people would die during this conflict. By 1858, there would be another series or round of unequal treaties. In the Treaty of Tianjin, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia all benefited from the opening of 11 additional ports, again, kind of leading to this expansion of trade. There would also be a customs service that would be headed and staffed by foreigners, Chinese officials. And this would be responsible, or these individuals would be responsible for directing Chinese trade, another kind of erosion of Chinese sovereignty. Under the terms of this treaty, the importation of opium was also legalized. Any Chinese resistance was met with immediate ramifications and repression. In 1860, the British forces occupied the capital, Beijing, and managed to burn the Summer Palace as well. So there was the Qing dynasty here is basically governing in name only, as far as its ability to have effective laws on the books that apply to all residents within its domain, as far as raising revenue from trade, as far as setting policy with regard to how trade is to be conducted. I mean, all of these things were being basically falling into the hands of non-Chinese interests. And these conditions persisted well into the 20th century, and they became increasingly codified via, again, these series of treaties. By the late 19th century, you have the outbreak of war again, this time in what's known as the Sino-Japanese War, lasting from 1894 to 1895. This is a war between Japan and China. They went to war over Korea and jurisdiction over that peninsula. This was really an overwhelming Japanese victory on a number of conflicts or battles on sea and land, and it resulted in yet another unequal treaty for China, this time being exploited by its immediate neighbor and rival, Japan. In this treaty, China ceded the island of Taiwan to Japanese authority, and also the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria was also to fall under Japanese control. Korean independence would be recognized as well, and Japan had more Chinese port cities opened to Japanese trade. And in addition, China was to pay indemnities to Japan for wartime expenses. This war alarmed Western powers, and it led to what's known as the tripartite intervention, namely led by Russia, Germany, and France. It compelled Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China in return or exchange for additional indemnities, additional monetary compensation. And that was agreed to. From 1896 to 1899, Russia, France, Germany, and Britain would continue to exploit China, extending loans to the Qing dynasty with interest rates ranging between 4 and 5%. Russia, in particular, would gain rights to operate its Trans-Siberian Railroad that extended all the way across the Asian landmass, and would traverse the portion of Manchuria that was under, at the time, Chinese control. So again, here you have a foreign power managing to exert its sovereignty over railroad infrastructure within the borders of China itself. The following year, or in 1899 as well, you have Secretary of State John Hay issuing a series of notes which became known as the Open Door Policy, which essentially explicitly secured the agreement from these this conglomerate of great powers to observe particular spheres of influence over respective portions of China. So there's a coordination here that these emerging, established or emerging world powers wouldn't really kind of step on each other's toes as far as how China, as far as their series of influence in China were concerned. And this is done without any regard to uh, Chinese officials or the Chinese government whatsoever. In Japan, there is a change of regime that's going to be taking place. This is the end, essentially, of the Tokugawa system and its successor, in an event what's known as the Meiji Restoration. Now, if you recall, the Tokugawa era had prided itself on closing its borders and closely monitoring and constricting uh, access to and interaction with foreign powers. This limited knowledge to the wider world in many cases, but it was to a small kind of cadre, which became known as the Dutch scholars, in which the small group of Japanese intellectuals managed to keep up with world events by their interaction with those foreigners that were permitted to engage in trade or other forms of interaction with Japanese culture and its population. They managed to, uh, when provided with Western texts, they would translate those texts of knowledge. This pertained to fields including astronomy, chemistry, geography, mathematics, physics, as well as military affairs, consisting of things like ballistics, metallurgy, and advances in military tactics as well. This made Japan one of the most learned of Asian powers in the Western sciences. So it has a much better footing, you might say, as far as its ability to uh, react to and adapt to the changing kind of complexities and realities that are taking place in the 19th century. Amidst all this, however, the Tokugawa order was losing the initiative in dictating terms of interaction with foreigners. Russia, for example, sought to expand trade relations. This occurred soon after uh, Russian ships and merchant vessels began appearing on in northern islands near Hokkaido, the northernmost island of the Japanese chain of islands. Also, with the outcome of the Opium Wars, uh, where Britain basically dictated terms of foreign relations with China, this also heavily impacted Japan. It marked a potential challenge of the Tokugawa era's existing foreign policy, this idea of isolation. That and it was kind of an eye-opening experience for Tokugawa leadership and Japan as a whole, because they saw that if they were on the losing end of conflict with these Western powers, then they may suffer this exact same fate as China had. So British ascension here as a dominant power in the Pacific was a perceived threat to Japanese interests. This all came to a head in 1853 with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's mission to Edo, the capital of Tokugawa era Japan. Matthew Perry was a U.S. government official. He was a commandant, naval officer, uh, tasked with establishing official relations with Japan to basically provide protection for shipwrecked American sailors, to secure acquisition of coaling stations for mechanized naval vessels flying the United States flag. Perry wanted to have the right to take on provisions if U.S. ships needed to do so. They wanted to establish trade with Japan, and they also, the United States here, wanted to assert its own strategic influence in the Pacific Ocean as well. Having consolidated control over the Oregon Territory and California as well by the 1840s, here the United States is beginning to press its influence and establish itself all the way on the almost halfway around the world here with this expeditionary force under Commodore Perry's command. So Commodore enters the Edo harbor and he delivers these terms, and he allows for a 1 year period of time in which the Japanese could decide on a course of action for themselves. In Tokugawa, Japan, there were two schools of thought that basically framed the nature of the debate as to how Japan was going to respond to Perry's terms. On the one hand, you have the Kaikoku kind of school of thought, which can best be described as kind of open country. They were most or best represented by these Dutch scholars and their view that Western technology eclipsed Japan's capabilities during this period of time. And essentially, the supporters of this Kaikoku or open country idea saw the need for acquiring Western weapons, for example, in order to use them to protect Japan's interests and preserve its autonomy, essentially. So this is what you might say is a more kind of realist school of thought here. One of their leading members was a man named Sakuma Shozen. He was an influential member of the samurai class. He was a samurai scholar. And he sought essentially a combination of Eastern Confucianism mixed with Western pragmatism in order to mold and craft a unique kind of independent Japanese identity. He was an admirer of Russia's Peter the Great, who himself, if you recall, was very Western oriented and also was a strong advocate for meritocracy. Opposed to the Kaikoku were those who supported this concept of Joey, which best could be described as expel the barbarians. Members of this school of thought were more xenophobic in their outlook. China's defeat, in particular, during the Opium Wars, they believed, these expel the barbarians kind of perspective, believed that that defeat came as a result of the contamination of Western religion and culture that had infiltrated Qing Dynasty China. Members of this Joey school of thought held a zealous kind of commitment to Japan's imperial order, embracing the mystical kind of embodiment of that the emperor held in his connection with the Japanese nation itself. A key group within this faction were those of the Mito scholars, such as Azawa Seishisai, who believed that the Western threat was more ideological rather than technological. They believed that Christianity was a form of indoctrination in order to subjugate those that the West colonized, and that, again, they point to the turn of fortunes in China as a, example A, essentially. So members of this Joey school offered an alternative known as Kokutai, which was a emperor-styled system, where this would not only be it would be kind of a quasi-religious ideology where the Japanese state would acquire kind of a mystical connotation in and of itself, creating a bond between the common people and the struggles of the nation. And the linchpin would be the emperor between the nation and its people. By the late 1850s, Japan does agree to what might be best described as an unequal treaty of its own. In 1858, this is best represented by the Harris Treaty, named after Towson Harris, the first American consul to Japan. And according to the terms of the treaty, Japan agreed to open Edo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Najita, and Yokohama harbors to U.S. trade. Japan would also agree to place Japan's tariffs under international control in exchange for fixed import duties pegged at lower levels. And there were also extraterritoriality terms to this agreement that favored U.S. citizens or U.S. officials living and residing in Japan. There would also be a series of separate unequal treaties that would be ratified with Britain, France, Holland, and also Russia. And these would follow in a matter of weeks after the Harris Treaty was agreed to. So the pace with which all of this was occurring, you can see here, is extremely rapid. Japan was here destined, you might say, for the same fate as China. However, they did experience what became known as the Meiji Restoration, which helped to actually reverse Japan's fortunes for the remainder of the 19th century and forward into the 20th as well. And that's where we'll turn our attention now. The Meiji Restoration came as a result of a culmination of factors. First, it's this embrace of a strong nationalist sentiment that we just talked about. Also, the Tokugawa Bakufu, the kind of leading echelon, agreed to have local daimyo offer input on developments in these foreign relations. So the Tokugawa house here is basically saying, well, turn to its vassals, its kind of lower ranking members, its provincial leadership, for debate and kind of an airing of ideas for an effective response that might be in the best interests of the state as a whole, for Japan as a whole. When that happened, this was taken as a sign of weakness by the daimyo of these various provinces, and so they began to and it was mostly these provincial leaders that resented foreign interference. But at the same time, they recognized that Japan's predicament and the need for buying time here in order to strengthen the Japanese nation and preserve its, as much as possible, its autonomy. But the Bakufu here is going to, once it opens that kind of dialogue, then it really is going to kind of take on a life of its own as far as these local provincial daimyo beginning to dictate the pace of events that followed thereafter. One of the best examples of this comes with political assassination, targeting the Tokugawa leadership itself. When that happens, when you have this vacancy, this vacuum within at the highest peak of the Tokugawa leadership, this allowed provincial leaders to consolidate more power for themselves and basically redirect their loyalties from the Bakufu to the Japanese emperor. And in January of 1868, Emperor Mushihito became the Meiji emperor and became the basically replaced the Tokugawa era and the Tokugawa order. This was essentially a coup d'etat. One historian described it as, quote, the displacement of one feudal order by another, unquote. And that's why we refer to it as a restoration rather than a revolution. This change, the change was made in the name of old values, not in the installation of new ones. So where you have the example like the French Revolution, where you have a complete upending of governing philosophy, where the power itself is being taken from the absolute elite monarchist model and handed directly to the mass citizenry of the country. Here, what you have is essentially a redirection of autocratic power from the Tokugawa family and Bakufu to the Japanese emperor. And this was championed most aggressively, perhaps, and most ardently by the disillusioned samurai class that had been, kind of fallen into disfavor and to disuse essentially during the latter stages of the Tokugawa system that we discussed in the previous lectures. Under this new Meiji restoration and this new imperial order, the government was much more centralized. The government controlled the economy. It established a universal system of education for the Japanese society. It adopted, in many cases, Western science and scientific standards. It constructed, the Japanese government constructed a merchant marine. It also conducted foreign trade and foreign relations, and it also provided a strong national defense. Between 1868 and 1890, this Meiji leadership pursued industrialization, and they also took on a very kind of flexible approach to reconciling the two competing schools of thought between the Kaikoku and the Joi factions. There is this shift from a xenophobic kind of outlook towards foreigners to more a xenophilic type of approach, where there would be this adulation in many respects of Western culture and science and teachings. So there's a hybrid that's taking place here, which is important to highlight and comprehend, because on the one hand you have these conservatives, political elites that are simply redirecting their loyalties from one autocratic leader to another, but they're also at the same time embracing more kind of kaikoku oriented or open country types of aspects. They're using those means in order to achieve a Joi or this expel the barbarian type of ends in many cases. And that's going to be reflected all the way through up to the closing days of World War II in 1945. The Meiji leadership was also a cadre of young leaders. In 1868, the average age of this kind of core group of leaders was just over 30 years old. And over the remaining portion of the 19th century, the Meiji leadership is going to pick and choose from various Western sources how and models they would incorporate into their own modernization of Japan. For example, from Britain, Japan organized its navy, its telegraph system, and its postal system. And from France, Japan would organize its army, its primary school system, its law enforcement system, and also its judicial system. From the United States, Japan would organize its, also be influenced in its organization of its primary school system. It would also look to the United States for models to craft its own national banking system, and also for the Sapporo Agricultural College and its creation. From Germany, Japan would take elements of the German Imperial Army and incorporate some of those aspects into the reorganization of the Japanese army. And also from Belgium, they would look to Japan would look to Belgium for inspiration or models for creating the Bank of Japan. And this happened from the late 1860s all the way up into the 1880s, from the 1860s to the 1880s. Another key development that took place soon after the Meiji Restoration occurred was that of the Irakawa mission, lasting from 1871 to 1873. This was named for Prince Irakawa Tomomi. Tomomi. This was a prominent member of the mission. It was comprised of kind of a group of Japanese officials that basically toured the world and Western powers during this 2-year span. And it was a 2-year sojourn in order to study all aspects of Western life and Western society, Western culture, and Western identity as well. So they are looking at everything from education systems to economic systems to political systems to policies to law enforcement. That laundry list of areas of civil society that Japan drew from. At the end of the 2-year period, this mission, the Irakawa mission, published their findings and recommendations in a 2,000-page report that spanned 5 volumes of text. And it formed the basis for how Japan was going to close the gap with Western powers. Close the technological gap, the kind of ideological gaps or scientific gaps or what have you, in order to become more to bring Japan into kind of a more modern model of state existence. Japanese society also looked to realign itself, starting with the family. They hoped that they could reorganize the family to become a series of more independent, smaller nuclear family units, rather than kind of have this lineage of ancestral worship that had been the traditional form of practice. But in many cases, this fell short of its intended desires. It proved to be a sticking point in many cases, meeting resistance from within the conservative Meiji leadership itself. And this gets to underlying kind of tensions here between how much change is necessary, and what is the extent of change that is acceptable, essentially by political leadership, by society itself. By 1889, you have the institution of what became known as the Meiji Constitution. Now, what's important to understand about this development is that it was presented as a gift from the emperor to his people. So it's not a democratic manifestation at all. The emperor would retain all executive authority embodied within the emperor himself. Ministers were responsible to the emperor, not to the people or to the constitution. Supreme command of the army and the navy resided in the hands of the emperor, and also the emperor could suspend the diet, basically the legislative body, which was bicameral, at any time. So it really, this is it's a Meiji constitution, but it lacks any real authority or any real teeth to it, essentially. Let me pause here because we're getting kind of long in this recording. So we'll come back and take the last few minutes here to wrap up this lecture. Right? Stay tuned.